Okay, so get this right. I always thought brass bands, like I always picture them marching through those smoky industrial towns up north, England and Wales,
Yeah.
like a real product of those coal mines and factories.
Yeah.
But I was reading this article, super interesting, from the Historical Journal. It's called British Military Music and the Legacy of the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm.
And wow, let me tell you,
Mm-hmm.
my whole view of brass bands has been like totally flipped on its head.
Oh, really?
Turns out those cavalry bands, everyone knows, they were actually inspired by military bands.
Yeah, that's right. You got it.
That-
The research from a historian, Dr. Eamonn O'Keeffe, points to the start of British brass bands way earlier than we usually think, right in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking the 1810s,
Okay.
which is like a good 20 years before those industrial towns even started forming their own bands.
So you're telling me those iconic cavalry bands everyone thinks of when they think brass music, they were actually modeled after military bands?
Yeah, pretty much.
That's crazy. So what's the connection? I mean, were soldiers just like jamming out between battles or something?
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
Dr. O'Keeffe's research shows that regimental bands started adding all brass setups much earlier than people thought, like way earlier. He found that the 15th Regiment of Foot, for example,
Okay.
they had already gotten rid of the woodwinds and had gone full brass with a bugles-only band by 1818.
A bugles-only band.
Mm-hmm.
That must have been like an intense
Oh,
sound.
yeah,
You
yeah.
could practically feel the ground shake, just
Oh.
thinking about it.
It would have been, yeah, quite a powerful sound.
Wow.
And it wasn't just them. Even the elite lifeguards were gifted, like valved trumpets by the Russian Tsar. Can you believe it?
No way.
By 1830, tons of regiments had fully embraced all brass bands.
Even the Tsar was a fan of the brass sound.
Hmm.
So how did this military brass band craze make the jump from the battlefield to civilian life?
Well, a lot of Napoleonic War veterans, after they experienced the power and camaraderie of military music, they went on to establish civilian brass bands all over Britain in the 1820s and 30s.
So these veterans, back from the war, they brought their love of music, their musical skills back home with them.
Right.
It makes sense they'd want to keep the music going, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But wasn't the industrial North like the heartland of the brass band movement?
That's what a lot of people believe, yeah.
Yeah.
But Dr. O'Keeffe's findings actually show a different picture. These early civilian bands weren't just in the industrial North.
Okay.
Like the Colyton Brass Band, for instance. They were playing God Save the King in a village in Devon as early as 1828.
Devon. That's nowhere near those industrial centers we usually think of when we think of brass bands.
Nope.
So we're talking like rural villages, years before those northern cavalry bands even started up.
Yeah, it seems like brass bands were popping up everywhere.
Okay, so we've got veterans forming bands all over the country, but why brass? What was it about this specific setup that caught on so fast?
One key thing was the Napoleonic Wars themselves. Just the sheer amount of military music during this time was huge. By 1814, there were over 20,000 musicians in the British military.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot of people exposed to this new way of making music.
20,000 musicians.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just about marching tunes on the battlefield.
Right.
These military bands must have been playing all over the place.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They were performing at all sorts of public events, concerts, balls, processions. They exposed a huge chunk of the British public to the sounds of these military bands, including brass.
Okay.
And these tunes weren't just like background noise either. They were often pretty catchy, upbeat, tapping into that like basic human love for rhythm and melody.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's fascinating how these military tunes kind of infiltrated everyday life.
Yeah.
It must have been more than just catchy tunes, right? What about the instruments themselves?
Yeah.
Was there something about brass that made it really appealing to people?
Well, I mean, brass instruments are inherently powerful and attention-grabbing. It's a sound that can fill a space, command attention, and bring out a lot of different emotions, from majestic and celebratory to somber and reflective.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about the melodies. It was about that bold brass sound that really grabbed people's attention. It's almost like you can feel the music vibrating in your chest. But let's talk about the people behind the instruments.
Yeah.
What happened to all those musicians after the war ended?
Well, a lot of those demobilized soldiers, after spending years getting good at music, they looked for ways to keep making music in civilian life.
Yeah.
They became music instructors, performers, composers. Some even became opera singers.
So the military was basically like a training ground for a whole generation of musicians.
Yeah, basically.
That's amazing. I bet a lot of them turned to brass bands to keep playing.
Oh, yeah, you're exactly right. Some joined existing militia bands and volunteer bands, while others took the lead in making new amateur wind and brass bands. And these civilian bands often mirrored their military counterparts, They had similar structures, uniforms, musical repertoires.
So in a way, they were bringing their military experience into the civilian world, shaping the musical scene with their skills and their passion for brass music. It's incredible to think about the lasting impact of the Napoleonic Wars, not just on politics and society, but on music and culture as a whole.
It really is. And it wasn't just about the musicians themselves.
Okay.
The Napoleonic Wars also created this huge influx of affordable secondhand instruments. They hit the market after Waterloo.
Of course. Supply and demand. With all those musicians leaving the military, there must have been a ton of instruments around.
Exactly. Aspiring musicians suddenly had access to instruments they could actually afford, which made it much easier to form their own bands. Dr. O'Keeffe even mentions these musicians from the Herefordshire militia. They actually petitioned to keep their instruments after being discharged.
I can only imagine how attached they must have been to those instruments, having played them with their comrades and all.
Yeah.
So we've got veterans forming bands, a bunch of instruments up for grabs. It's like the perfect storm for the start of a whole musical movement.
It really is. And we can't forget about all the advances in technology. The Napoleonic Wars had kicked off a real boom in instrument design. New instruments, like the keyed bugle, invented by an Irish militia bandmaster in 1810, and then later the saxhorn, they became super popular for early brass bands, which helped them grow even more.
So not only were there more instruments, but they were also evolving, becoming more versatile, more expressive. That must have opened up so many creative possibilities for those early brass bands.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't forget about the music itself.
Right.
Many of these early brass bands kept playing military tunes that had become popular during the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
These tunes were familiar, and they really resonated with people on a deep level.
It's like those melodies were woven into the fabric of their lives, carrying memories of the good times and the bad times of war. Do we have any examples of these tunes that stuck around?
Oh, for sure. One tune is The Downfall of Paris. It's a regimental quick march that ended up being a favorite of street musicians and even piano teachers. A music critic in 1827 even complained about how popular it was, saying that it was overshadowing like Bach and Mozart.
Wow. Imagine a time when a military march was considered more popular than Bach. That really shows how much those tunes had become a part of British culture.
Yeah, for sure.
It wasn't just background music. It was the soundtrack to everyday life.
Exactly. These tunes brought up feelings of heroism, patriotism, even a little bit of melancholy. They connected people to a shared history and a sense of national identity. And, we should remember that brass bands weren't just for entertainment.
Okay.
They had a much deeper social role, too, especially in the post-war period.
So it wasn't just about catchy tunes and impressive instrumentation. It was about something more. What kind of social role did these bands play?
Well, brass bands went beyond social classes, They became popular in a lot of different settings. They were entertainment, of course.
Yeah.
But they also helped create a sense of community, especially after the war, when people were looking for connection and a sense of belonging.
It seems like these bands were a unifying force, bringing people together from all walks of life.
Exactly.
It's amazing how something as simple as a brass band could be so important in shaping society. But we've covered a lot already.
Yeah, we have.
I want to learn more about how these early civilian bands were structured, how they were organized, and how that was influenced by their military origins.
Right.
Let's get into that next.
It's fascinating when you think about it, how these veterans coming back from the Napoleonic Wars, they basically brought their musical world back home with them.
Yeah.
Imagine, right? You're a soldier. You've spent years on the parade ground, honing your skills with your comrades, playing for big crowds, feeling that, discipline, that shared purpose.
It's only natural that when you go back to civilian life,
yeah,
you'd want to find ways to keep making music.
That makes total sense. It's like you're bringing a part of that military life back with you.
Right.
But did these civilian bands, did they just copy everything from the military bands? Did they wear the same uniforms?
Well, they definitely took inspiration.
Okay.
A lot of early civilian bands they went for those military-style uniforms.
Yeah.
You know, added that visual element.
Right.
That really underlined that link to the military.
Okay.
It's really interesting how that military look became such a part of brass bands.
It's like they were making a visual reminder of their shared experiences and the values they learned in the military, right? Discipline, teamwork, precision. But this was also a time of huge change in Britain. Social change, economic change.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution was changing everything.
Yeah.
So how did brass bands fit into all of that? That's a great question. I mean, Britain was going through this huge shift, right? From a farming society to an industrial one.
Yeah.
People were heading to the cities for work. Those old social structures were being challenged left and right.
Right.
In all that chaos, brass bands gave people a sense of stability, familiarity, shared purpose, something that really spoke to people from all different walks of life.
So they were like a bridge between the old and the new.
Yeah, exactly.
Giving a sense of continuity in the middle of all this crazy change.
Yeah, they were a space where people could come together no matter what their background was, you know,
Yeah.
no matter their job, and just share in the joy of music.
It's amazing how something as simple as a brass band could be so important in shaping society.
Yeah.
But wasn't there also this huge wave of national pride in Britain back then? Especially after winning the Napoleonic Wars?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Did brass bands tap into that feeling?
For sure. Britain was becoming a global power, right? There was this growing sense of patriotism, national pride. Brass bands, with their military roots in those rousing melodies, they became a real symbol of that national spirit.
It's like they were a musical version of British strength, you know?
Yeah.
Resilience.
Yeah.
And their popularity wasn't just limited to one particular group of people, right?
That's right. One of the coolest things about brass bands is that they could bring people together from all different backgrounds. You'd see them at royal events, and then you'd see them at working class gatherings, too. They created this shared experience that went beyond social and economic barriers.
It shows how universal music is. Its power to bring people together.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if this cross-class appeal, if maybe it came from the military itself. Because in the Army, soldiers from all different backgrounds, they fight side by side, united for a common goal.
That's a really interesting point, yeah. The military, with its focus on discipline, teamwork, sacrifice, it definitely could have created a sense of equality that influenced brass bands. Also, a lot of these early bands were formed by veterans who knew what war was really like. They knew how important unity and cooperation were.
It's almost like their music was carrying this message, you know, of peace, reconciliation, this desire for a world where people from different backgrounds can get along.
It's a powerful thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
It speaks to the lasting legacy of these bands. I mean, they weren't just about entertainment. They were about community building, national pride, and maybe even promoting this vision of a better society.
It's inspiring to think that something as, well, simple as a brass band could have such a big impact. But let's switch gears a bit, okay? Talk about the music itself.
Okay.
We've touched on the military origins of some of these tunes, but what made them so appealing to so many different people?
Well, one key thing was how easy they were to understand. These were melodies that were easy to learn, easy to sing along to. They weren't super complicated,
Right.
which made them perfect for amateur musicians and people just listening for fun. Plus, they were often catchy, upbeat, playing into that human need for rhythm and melody.
Right. I can almost hear those marches and melodies echoing through those post-war streets and towns.
Yeah.
It's like they get under your skin.
Yeah.
You hum them while you work, whistle them in the street, maybe even dance to them at parties. They were part of everyday life.
Exactly. And don't forget about the emotions they brought up.
Yeah.
A lot of them were rooted in military tradition, you know, feelings of heroism, patriotism, even a bit of sadness.
Yeah.
They could stir something inside you, bring back memories, create a sense of shared experience. No wonder they were so popular with so many different people.
It sounds like they tapped into something basic, something that went beyond words and social barriers.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just the melodies themselves, right?
Yeah.
The instruments and brass bands, they played a big role too.
Oh, absolutely. The sound of brass, it's powerful. It grabs your attention. It can be majestic and celebratory or somber and thoughtful. It fills a space, makes you listen, brings out all kinds of emotions.
And when you put that powerful sound together with catchy melodies and those uniformed musicians,
Yeah.
it's a pretty captivating experience.
Exactly. It hits you on so many levels. No wonder brass bands became so popular, drawing crowds wherever they went.
So we've got simple melodies, powerful instruments, a visual spectacle, and a whole lot of emotion. That explains why brass bands are still so popular. But we can't forget that these bands were more than just entertainment.
Right.
They were a product of their time, reflecting what was going on in 19th century Britain. Socially, economically, politically.
You're right. To really understand how important brass bands were, we got to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
This was a time of huge change. Industrialization, urbanization, all that. Britain was changing rapidly, and brass bands played a unique part in that process.
So how did these bands reflect that changing Britain? What specific things were going on that they embodied?
Well, one key thing was the rise of the working class.
Okay.
As Britain industrialized, tons of people were moving to cities, working in factories.
Right.
This created a whole new social class. They had their own culture, their own identity. Brass bands became a powerful expression of that working class culture. They gave people a sense of community, of solidarity in the middle of all the challenges of city life.
So these bands, they were a voice for those who didn't have one.
Exactly. They gave a platform to people who were often marginalized, ignored by the mainstream.
And it wasn't just about giving them a voice, it was about giving them chances to grow and develop, right?
That's right. Brass bands gave a lot of working class people a chance to move up in the world.
Okay.
They learned new skills, learned discipline and teamwork, maybe even earned some money through performances. For a lot of them, it was an escape from the daily grind of factory life, a way to find purpose and fulfillment.
It reminds you that music can be more than just something nice to listen to.
Yeah.
It can be a way to change society, a way to empower people.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the working class who benefited from brass bands. These bands also helped create social cohesion, promote civic pride in communities all over Britain.
So they brought people together, created a sense of shared identity.
Exactly. They were a focal point for communities,
Yeah.
for gatherings, celebrations, even political rallies. They helped bridge the gaps between people and create a feeling of belonging.
It's incredible that something as simple as a brass band could have such a big effect on the way society works.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the money side of things either.
Right.
How did the Industrial Revolution affect how brass bands developed?
Well, for one thing, instruments became more affordable.
Okay.
As mass production got better, the price of brass instruments went down, making them accessible to more people. This was huge because it allowed working class people to start their own bands.
So the Industrial Revolution actually made it possible for brass bands to really take off.
Exactly. It created the economic conditions for this musical form to really thrive.
It shows that even artistic movements are affected by the practical realities of their time. But it wasn't just about the instruments being cheaper. The Industrial Revolution also created new places for brass bands to play.
That's right. As cities grew, they built new public spaces.
Yep.
Parks, squares, concert halls. All these places gave brass bands a stage to perform on. And don't forget about the factories themselves. A lot of factory owners liked the idea of their workers having brass bands.
Oh, yeah.
They saw it as a way to boost morale, to
right.
get people feeling loyal to the company.
So these bands were literally becoming part of industrial life.
Yeah, they were a soundtrack to the Industrial Revolution, showing both the good and the bad of that era.
It's amazing to see how this type of music grew alongside all the social and economic changes happening in Britain.
Right.
But it wasn't just about society and economics, right? Brass bands also had a political side to them.
Yeah, that's important. Brass bands got linked to different political movements and ideas, reflecting all the different, sometimes conflicting values of 19th century Britain.
So how did these bands get involved in the politics of the time?
Well, on one hand, brass bands were embraced by, the conservative side of things. They saw them as a way to promote patriotism, social order, traditional values.
Okay.
You often see them in military parades, royal events, religious ceremonies,
Right.
all reinforcing that idea of national unity, respect for authority.
So for some people, they were a symbol of stability,
Yeah.
of keeping things the same during a time of big changes.
Exactly. But then brass bands were also adopted by the progressive movements. They saw them as a way to express dissent.
Okay.
To push for social reform, to fight for the rights of the working class.
So they were used to both maintain the status quo and to challenge it.
Exactly. That's one of the most interesting things about brass bands.
Yeah.
They could be used to support all sorts of political agendas, showing just how complex and contradictory the times were.
It reminds you that music is rarely just music.
Yeah.
It often comes with political and social baggage, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. We have to remember that when we're looking at the history of brass bands, we can't just see them as harmless entertainment. We need to understand the social, political, and economic forces that shaped them and all the different ways they were used and interpreted.
It's like peeling back the layers, revealing the hidden complexity under the surface.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
It shows that even the most ordinary things can be super revealing when you look at them through the lens of history.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is more than just facts and dates. It's about understanding human stories, how all these different forces come together to shape our world.
And the story of brass bands is a perfect example of that.
Right.
It takes us from battlefields to factories, from working-class streets to fancy concert halls. It's a story of war and peace, tradition and innovation, social division and cultural unity. It's a story that's still being written today, as brass bands continue to be a big part of communities around the world. It reminds us that music has this power to go beyond borders, to inspire hope, to bring people together.
And it all started with a simple question. Where did brass bands come from? Turns out the answer is much more complex and interesting than we might have thought.
It's amazing, isn't it? To think something as, well, normal as a brass band playing in a park has such a long and complicated history.
Yeah.
It really makes you hear those bright, powerful sounds in a whole new way.
It really does. It reminds us that history isn't just something, you read in a book.
Right.
It's all around us, even in the music we hear.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really cool about what we talked about today is how it changes those ideas we have about things we think we know.
Yeah, you're right. We started off thinking of brass bands as a product of those industrial towns, up north.
Mm-hmm.
But look what we found.
We found this whole vibrant history, before industrialization even, with roots in the military. And geographically, it was much more widespread than we thought at first.
Yeah.
It just shows you got to dig deeper, question those stories everyone accepts without really thinking about them.
Because who knows what other hidden stories are out there? Like what other everyday things might have these unexpected, fascinating pasts?
That's what's so great about history and really about learning in general.
Mm-hmm.
There's always more to find out, more connections to make, more ways of looking at things. It's a journey that never ends.
So I guess as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of brass bands, the takeaway is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Don't judge a band by its cover, right? Or by its, seemingly simple sound.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole symphony of history playing underneath, just waiting for us to discover it.
I like that. It reminds us that even the most ordinary things can have these amazing stories behind them. And those stories can teach us so much about ourselves, our culture, and how the world came to be the way it is.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep that curiosity alive. You never know what amazing discoveries are waiting for you right around the corner.